Hello there, everyone. So, continuing on with our assessment of the Animus concept in analytical psychology, this time we're going to be concentrating on the female-centric animus. I want this video to be seen as an expansion from the previous segment, and as such, I'm going to try to avoid repeating myself. However, I am also conscientious of the fact that some people might not have seen the anima video yet, so a bit of light reiteration of the central points might be required here and there. Overall, I want those of you who have come here newly or off the back of the previous video to consider these two videos as a set, because even though I am relaying them in their respective sex-specific context, they are in essence addressing the same fundamental patterns in the human psyche. So the way that this video is going to be structured then, first I'm going to talk a bit about projection and just the general anatomy of the archetype. Then I'm going to talk about how it reveals itself in people and objects. And then to conclude, I'm going to close with a bit of light reflection on how society appeals to female psychology through the animus. All right then, so with all that being said, let's begin. Instead of just wading right in and talking about the animus directly, I think a really good place to start would be to talk about the delivery mechanism by which the archetype gives itself over to life: projection. Projection is one of the mechanisms by which psychological contents that were previously unconscious are made conscious in the mind. Yet instead of recognizing that it belongs to the activity of our own mind, we perceive it as radiating from someone or something else. Therefore, in the case of projection onto people, we might perceive someone as being indescribably alluring, mysterious, magnetic, demonic even. Indeed, we can come to all sorts of dark and paranoid judgments about complete strangers who, for whatever reason, activate these sentiments in us. So not only can projection colour our perception of reality, it can also have a possessive aspect, making us do and say things that surprise our sense of familiar identity. This quote from Carl Jung highlights in a very concise way the general principle that we're talking about here. I recognise that there is some psychic factor active in me which eludes my conscious will in the most incredible manner. It can put extraordinary ideas into my head, induce in me unwanted and unwelcome moods and emotions, lead me to astonishing actions for which I can accept no responsibility, upset my relations with other people in very irritating ways. I feel powerless against this fact, and what is worse, I am in love with it, so all I can do is marvel. The descriptions that Jung is talking about here demonstrate the possessive hold that unconscious contents can have over an individual who might otherwise consider themselves to be completely healthy and normal. Though normalcy for human beings never includes the full range of what constitutes the realities of being human, there are always parts of ourselves which we regard as inhuman or abnormal, and accordingly we discard them to the hinterlands of our souls as not real parts of ourselves. There are together with this the most peculiar of matters which we have become so deeply habituated to that we no longer regard them as strange at all. One of the most telling examples in this regard is the inconsistency surrounding our personal volition, our conscious ability to censor and audit our own behaviour in real time. We may festoon our lives with narratives of rationality and self-agency, but they betray the many times that we spoke and acted outside the limits of our conscious framework, only to startle back and state something to the effect of, "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. I didn't mean what I was saying." Or we might even declare, "That wasn't really me talking." Despite the myriad ways that we try to distance ourselves from the unsettling realities of our own nature, It's important for us to understand that the contents of these projections are often vital aspects of our own personality that have fallen into the unconscious and are activated when we are confronted by things which correspond to their source of origin. Somebody might be talking about a topic that triggers an old memory inside us, something so old that we'd forgotten about it because it happened to us at a time when we were very young, and immediately we begin reacting to that individual in accord with how that original memory made us feel. This reactionary type of behaviour is commonly witnessed in people who harbour a history of abuse. However, in actual fact, it's an established aspect of human behaviour. Another thing to know is that this mechanism of projection is actually united to the psyche's process of regulating itself. The human psyche, like the biological systems, have the ability to self-regulate. Therefore, mechanisms like projection can be seen as a way for the unconscious mind to alert consciousness to the areas of its life that are in disharmony. We see from many thousands of cases in therapy where a confrontation and assimilation of this unconscious material is necessary, and it's for this reason why it can be seen as part of the healing process. But because none of us are conditioned from a young age to relate to our minds in this way, most of us simply repress or project what the unconscious sends up to conscious shores. It is for this reason why the quality of a woman's animus expression is always concordant with the quality of her conscious level. In other words, if she has a low-resolution relationship to her psychological life, as most of us actually do, the animus is more likely to present itself in negativistic lights, dark moods, irrational anxieties, fantasies of oppression, or even self-termination. Let's listen to what Jung had to say as a man about the negative effects of being the subject of an animus projection. When someone has an animus projection on me, I feel as though I were a tomb with a corpse inside. I am like one of those tombs that Jesus speaks of, with all sorts of vermin inside. And moreover, decidedly, a corpse myself, one doesn't feel one's own life. A real animus projection is murderous because one becomes the place where the animus is buried, and he is exactly like the eggs of a wasp in the body of a caterpillar, and when the young hatch out, they begin to eat one from within. I selected this quotation because the strong language Jung uses is indicative of what a negative projection can feel like for those under it. However, if a woman redirects her attention in the opposite direction, which is to say inwardly rather than always outwardly, and gradually learns throughout her life to effect a more conscientious relationship to her psychic contents, what once presented itself as a possessive agent can convert into a benefactor, bearing essential information about the nature of her mind and life history. This conversion from black to white is the alchemical result of all therapy, taking raw psychological material and discovering in it the hidden information that awards insight into the inner workings of the individual's dilemma. If successful, this process can work towards a liberating effect, bringing about a new renaissance within the life of that person. As we mentioned in the previous video, a big obstacle of even getting to that stage is due to the fact that the conscious mind does not speak the language of the unconscious, which is to say, it doesn't speak the picture language of symbols. So I think it would be a good idea now to talk more symbolically about the animus. I really like old phrases and folk wisdom because they often reveal, whether accidentally or otherwise, the image of archetypal patterns. Such as the old saying, "Behind every great man there is a great woman." Likewise, the animus is to be found behind the life of every great female artist, champion athlete, careerist, adventurer, entrepreneur, expectant mother, project manager, and terrorist. Because the animus inspires in the mind of these people images of potential for being, and if successfully possessed by such an image, she will embark upon a mission to realize it. As projected contents, the animus is discovered in subjects which render unto a woman's mind the image of her wholeness, or her life force. Now, that may sound far too ambiguous for some, however in reality it will always be, because these images present themselves in a myriad of different ways specific to each individual. Life force is simply a term that accounts for the psyche's ability to sense itself as a dynamic living system, and how it conceptualizes this through representation using appropriate subjects that associate to these dynamics. Perhaps a more accessible way of conceiving the animus would be to reflect back on one's own life history and think about occasions when we've been presented by something or someone that has had an overwhelming effect on us. Do you remember seeing an advertisement for a product that gripped your attention so much that you immediately motivated to acquire it? We might have considered borrowing some money or selling off something that we already owned to own that thing that was the focus of our obsession. For in that moment, it became an extension of our life force, and we sought to unite with it so that it could become an integrated aspect of our lives. We might say that in that moment, the consumer object became interpreted as a symbol of transformation that spoke to our impetus for psychological wholeness. But because this is being projected, we interpret it as stemming from the desirable product, and not, as it is in reality, from the activities of our own nervous system. It is also for this reason why we think that by acquiring the product, we will satisfy that desire for wholeness, because the effects of projection make us think that it is calling to us from the outside rather from within. Naturally, anyone who has ever experienced these effects before will be able to relate to the feeling of elation and temporary integration one feels after acquiring a desired item, only for that process to eventually exhaust itself, and we are returned into our habitual states of existential inconsistency. It might sound like a bit of a stretch to talk about consumer products in this way, but in fact it's far from it, because the professional advertisers of those products know that they are speaking to deeply powerful psychological currents inside us to make us react to these items in such energized ways. Okay then, to cite a less artificial example, can you think of a person that came into your life, it doesn't have to be romantic, but it's still relevant if it is, that had such an effect on you that to this day you still ruminate upon the memory of their influence? This individual may have brought a certain harmony or discord to your life, yet the one thing that stands out is that you'll never forget them. Behind both of these examples that I've given lies the same psychological pattern. It is the archetype that stands behind a woman's obsessions, her lusts, her intrigues, and aspirations for a better life. It was he who was speaking to her when she first fell in love, and he was close to her in the agonies that became from it. And it is the Animus who presents the image of her life's potentiality, the zygote dream that she will pursue and that delivers to her life all manner of new experiences, bonds, and dramas. But there is also the other side to these things, for the animus in a girl who has had a difficult life will festoon her days with poisonous moods and images of dark potential. The archetype returns to her like an incubus to sow in the marrow of her mind all sorts of spells which weave into the narrative of her personal agony. Under prolonged duress, she may come to find comfort in that which has her, and with the aid of that most brilliant of social masks, the persona, creates a front to all the world that belies the secret tragedy that her soul is quietly cannibalizing itself.
Why did you come here?
Because I tried to commit suicide.
Yes, I knew that, of course. But what I don't know is why you tried to do this. Could you tell us how you did it?
I took an overdose of pills.
100, didn't you?
100, yes.
And why did you want to commit suicide?
Because I didn't want to face anything.
This wasn't the first time.
No.
How often did you try?
Well, I've tried quite a few times.
Why did you try so persistently to take your own life? It's a difficult question.
Yes. I was just desperate, and I couldn't face things that had come up. So I thought the easy way out was to take pills and it would be all over. That's what I did.
You told me the other day that you have always made every effort not to show that you're depressed. Have you always made it a point to kind of cover up your real feelings?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I guess that's just part of me. When I was quite young, for a time I went through a stage where I was a real monster. I tried to get my mother's attention, which I couldn't get, and I would break things and cry and throw tantrums, and it didn't do any good. And then I realized that my aunts and other people could see how hurt I was, and I didn't want anyone to see, to be able to tell that I was hurt. So I just tried to be the opposite, I didn't care about anything. And it worked. People believed that I didn't care.
You learned to do it quite well.
Yes.
So the animus that speaks in these images of wholeness can have a possessive and destructive influence. For is not a depression a certain type of wholeness? Does it not present discolorations of the world's picture over to you in the way of complete images of yourself, images of those around you, images of your future or lack thereof? Does it not condense the entire macrocosm of all of your life's complexity down into a single dense neutron star, and present that to you as a holistic representation of what your life is in that moment? It is the agency that translates complex variables into inspired images of potential systems that characterizes the animus at the essential level. That, I think, and the possessive impetus that impels her to incarnate these potentials in time, albeit constructively or destructively. So you may be wondering, why does the anima and animus project onto members of the opposite sex? There will inevitably be different ways of answering this, but I think that the most reliable response will come from what we just said about projection. For centuries, men and women have represented opposite sides to each other. We could say that they are like living mirrors that reflect back different aspects of each other's lives. There are many reasons for this, most obviously due to the biosymbiotic nature of our relationship. Though considered at another more psychic level, men and women embody various aspects of humanity that we notice more so in one and less so in the other. Historically, men have come to characterize certain universals: analytical thinking, ingenuity, adventurousness, and aggression, for example. Females also have their own mantles: emotional thinking, nurturing, empathy, peevishness, vanity, and most universally, they have come to be seen as the embodiment of creation itself. Realistically, all of these characteristics can be found in either sex, yet when our minds invoke men and women as representations, which is to say, when we regard them as symbols, they tend to reflect certain qualities more so than others. The animus reveals itself in people or things that reflect back qualities that a woman's mind recognizes in itself, yet are sublimated beneath her conscious identity. This is the persona mask that represents the way that she regards herself. The recognition of these qualities in others can spark either attraction or aversion, but I want to focus more on the attractive side here because I think it'll be easier to relate to. So how does the capacity of the sexes to reflect back each other's unconscious nature play into the way that we form bonds that are conducive towards a sense of psychological wholeness? Well, the interaction between, on the one hand, a drive for biological wholeness in the mating union and the standards of differentiation we apply to the sexes establishes in the psyche a pair of corresponding symbols, and out of this, many cultural narratives emerge of opposites becoming wholes, with masculine and feminine characteristics playing respective roles in this synthesis. For when we mate, we become whole in a certain manner of speaking, and from this union a new life system is brought into the world. I think that we radically underestimate just how powerful these kind of experiences are in the shaping of the psyche's understanding of itself. It is our ability to consider and representationally convey our experience that is responsible for all the meta-conceptions that have been created across human cultures. Unions without become unions within, and the unconscious womb bears symbolic byproducts that populate both mind and culture, and that, like human offspring, wear the characteristics of the parental systems from which they emerged. However, the problems of psychological wholeness are a terribly complicated matter, and we still haven't found a way of adequately accounting for all of our complexities as conscious creatures within our life systems. As such, what we do not account for in ourselves gets psychologically repressed or projected onto external subjects which reflect their patterns. This is often seen in romantic settings, where an unstable individual, such as somebody with borderline personality type, will project idealizations of security and wholeness onto the other person, which symbolically represent subliminal desires to motivate from their habitual states of inconsistency into new life patterns. Whether we choose to interpret these projections as the products of wishful thinking or genuine motivations towards something more stable, they nonetheless complement the main point that I've been working up to here, namely that the very impetus that surrenders its images of potential and which motivates us towards inspired ends is the same force that activates when we are confronted by the image of that which our psyche interprets as the special other, the missing link which might facilitate such a synthesis. So I think that these two features on the anima and animus have given people a very detailed overview of what this concept is addressing and some of the ways that it reveals itself in life. I usually conclude these videos with a bit of heartfelt reflection on the subject at hand, and I was thinking about what I was going to say about the animus that would be fitting, not only to close off this video, but the pair of them as a whole. There's a general pattern that seems to be emerging in these videos for me as their creator, because I notice a definite scaling of quality in each one, and together with that I also notice that they keep on getting harder to make. These two videos have been some of the hardest because they speak to areas of the human condition that motivate us to shape what our life eventually becomes, because it provokes in us these images of what our life is and what it could potentially be. And what I've tried to emphasize throughout all of this is that essential pattern within the human condition that shows us these images of inspired potential, that has some major consequences for us, and that those consequences are not always pleasant. Which is why a lot of the material that I've employed here to helped describe the anima and the animus has been quite dark, because for many people it does reveal itself like that, or it has a deceptive element to it, because it can festoon your life with romantic projections that are nice and indulgent for a while, but those projections might influence your behavior in ways that don't conclude to a romantic destination. These things can really mess up your life if you're not conscientious. And a lot of the talk surrounding archetypes can be, in my opinion, a bit heavy on the inspired language. It's funny because it seems that as soon as people start talking about archetypes, we become possessed by them. And I think that what this does is that it distances us from the true picture of these subjects. And this problem of communication is the only part of people's work, like Joseph Campbell's, that I'm not particularly fond of. Joseph Campbell was an American mythologian who's done more work than any other, I think, in reacquainting modern consciousness with these old stories and enabling us to see the value in them again. Though the flip side to that is that the mode of deliverance that enamors people to it is also part of the reason why people often fail to understand them completely. Because if you really study myth, you realize a pattern that these things are actually quite dark and they convert later on into something positive, unless they're a tragedy, of course, in which case it's the other way around, obviously. Myths have been the historical incubator of these archetypes, and contemporary stories are the modern variants of that. And the general pattern of moving from a collapse or a calamity into something constructive is really important, because that's what dealing with archetypes in life is usually like. It's not always this pleasant romantic thing for us. It's like Demeter picking flowers in a meadow, and then suddenly Hades emerges with a chariot drawn by black horses and grabs her and takes her off into the underworld. That's how these things spring up on you. And they can take you to all kinds of destinations that you didn't see coming while you were, being entertained by the flowers of life, so to speak. So that's why a lot of this material has tried to press forward the point that the same phenomena in the psyche that can be utilized to bring a life together is the same phenomena that can deliver you into all sorts of strange hells. And you can try to avoid your responsibility and shut yourself off from the world and from other people and say, well, everything's just going to hell out there. I don't want any part of it. But the problem with that is you still have to contend with yourself. And if there's one constant that's always going to be there, wherever you are, or whatever you choose to make of yourself, it's that they'll always be there with you. And they'll always be exerting their influence on you in some effect. The only really question is, do you want them to act in accordance with your favor, so to speak? Or do you want them to eternally rape you? It's something to think about. And so we're going to close off now and talk about the animus as I see it reflected in society. Now, I'm no feminist, and I'm no fan of feminism per se, but I'm going to say something now that sounds like something a feminist might say. I think that females are the most heavily propagandized demographic in the entire Western world. And there are some serious reasons for this. Women represent the biggest consumer spending force in the world. And so naturally, they attract the most attention from advertisers who want to market their products to them. And if those advertisers want to be successful in this, I'll warrant that they'll be advised by at least someone on their team who knows something about human psychology and what motivates them. What kinds of imagery do women respond to more so than others? What kinds of colours do they find pleasant? Which ones they don't? What kind of messages are they more likely to respond to favourably, etc., etc.? When people are advertising to us, they are speaking to us in the language of our senses.
It's not a rational thing. It's primitive in that it's affecting us not through the intellect, but through the language of sound and pictures. And if we understand the process that we go through when making a product decision, I think that we'll find that it relates back to the patterns of the Animus quite well. Because, like we said earlier, products are glamoured to represent symbols of wholeness. And by uniting with them, which in this sense means purchasing them, we can acquire an artificial sense of satisfaction in our psyche, which then dissipates and begins again with a new product cycle. The zygote process, which the archetype represents, is being invoked and exploited in the consumer environment. And when we purchase something, we acquire not only an attractive item that's spoken to something inside us, we also acquire a small sense of what it feels like to accomplish the real process that the archetype is speaking to. Another thing that we see is that people in technological consumer societies are becoming more and more dissociated from themselves and each other. Women and men are failing to recognize themselves in the mirror. Products have now become the surrogate offspring for both our biological and psychological prerogatives. The image of our wholeness, which has traditionally been represented in natural counterparts, is now expressed most potently in the guise of artificial systems. Systems which deceive our core instincts into believing that by acquiring them, we have succeeded in our quest for psychological wholeness. Yet we all discover that after the magical dust settles, we're returned back into our state of wanting, and the whole process repeats in a vicious cycle over and over again. So aside from these consumer systems that tap into and exploit our natural drives, we also have ideologies. One of the things that Jordan Peterson once said that I thought was accurate is that he thinks that ideologies are like parasitic superstructures that tap into religious archetypal substructures. And I think that that's spot on. One of the great delusions that's imbibed into modern consciousness is that we represent this apex point of humanity, and therefore people who came before us in the past represent the inferior incremental stages up to what we have become today. And this mistranslation is born out of a recognition that notices the great leaps in only the past few hundred years in our knowledge, in our understanding of how the world works, in our technological systems, and it equates that into a belief that we have advanced with it as humans. So people living today must be superior in every conceivable way compared to somebody living in the past, because our systems have advanced. Therefore, the upgrade of those systems could only have been made possible because we had advanced with them. Do you see where the faulty logic stems from? And through the back door of this logic, this invites all manner of fallacious perceptions to creep in that, in my belief, lie at the very centre of why we have such a difficulty in accounting for many of the societal and interpersonal problems that we have today. It's precisely because we see ourselves as so advanced, as so sophisticated, as so rational, that actually makes us so gullible in the face of all of the manipulations that guide us both from within and without. In other words, what I'm saying is that people today are not less likely to fall into ideological possession than at previous times in history. They're in fact more likely to do so, because as a byproduct of modernity, they have had all of their foundations ripped from them, and they are left totally vulnerable and naked to the sorcerers of the world. The modern man and woman might have correct knowledge about the solar system, but they have virtually no knowledge in how to govern themselves. And increasingly what we're seeing is that we have less and less understanding of how to even interact with each other as reflections, because most of our involvement now is being facilitated through artificial as opposed to organic means. This leaves us very much wanting for guidance, and unfortunately, many women are finding that in some lifestyle guru or in some cult ideology like feminism, which I will say is the primary example of the negative animus writ large in society. Weak minds, or vulnerable minds, if I want to put that a bit kinder, vulnerable minds are drawn to powerful ideologies because the narratives that those ideologies manufacture tap into the sensitivities and the wounds that memory has carved into you. And these narratives not only validate your frustrations at the world for wounding you and leaving you so vulnerable, they direct you towards some other figure opposed to the cult ideology, like other men, that will then become the targets of your unconscious projection. There are literally thousands of women right now in the grip of their animus, falsely believing that other men are the image of their undoing and that which truly enslaves them. Were they to recognize the messages hidden in plain sight, however, they would know that it's not other men that enslave them, but the dark force coming from inside, which represents the cause and the cure of their dilemma. Strong women don't need to feel empowered because they're too busy putting what real power they have to good use. And the greatest powers in your life are those which have been gifted to you by nature. Not by what some product advertisement tells you what you are, and not by some political cult ideology that's going to convert you into an automaton so that it can expand its influence. That innate capacity for self-reflection that has grown up inside of you from the moment that you were born and that was a feature of every other woman in history, that is the uncultivated talent that you have to fortify yourself against a world that wants to make you its prostitute. And these are called life skills, deservingly so, because they require an entire lifetime to practice. There's only one path to a fulfilled life, and that's the long road. Don't take the easy way out and sell yourself out to the pimps of the world. And as for everybody else, look, you just have to simply let them get on with it. We're at the tail end of a civilizational process right now, and we're still trying to contend with being human. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you that will give you the power to heal, and start listening to the contents of what your unconscious is saying to you, because I'll tell you this in closing. One breakthrough in self-knowledge is worth 100 books on psychology. All right. I'm getting a bit tired now after contending with both the anima and the animus in these videos. I think that these two videos are some of the best that I've ever done, certainly within the Archetype series. I've really enjoyed making them, even though they have been so difficult because the rewards have been so strong. And I think that if you consider these two videos on the anima and the animus as a set, and you watch them over again and reflect on what's in there, I think you'll get a lot out of them. But yeah, like I said, now I'm very tired after making them. So I'm simply going to say thank you so much for watching, guys. And as usual, I'll see you again.